Picture this. A clay jar, sealed, buried in the Egyptian desert, not by accident, by design. Someone hid it, knowing that what was inside could get them killed. And they were right, because the people who wrote what's inside that jar were hunted down. Their communities were burned, their names were erased from history, and the institution that did it had the power of an empire behind it. That jar sat in the desert for 1600 years, undisturbed, forgotten. And then, in 1945, a farmer's mattock struck something hard in the sand and cracked it open. What was inside didn't just challenge the official version of history. It described with a precision that is still unsettling to read today the exact architecture of the system that buried it. Who controls this reality, how they control it, why most of humanity has no idea it's happening, and, most dangerously of all, how to break free. Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. If you find yourself falling down this rabbit hole with us, hit the like button and subscribe. And before we go any further, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time is it there. I ask every episode because it never stops surprising me. Every time I check the comments, this community spans more of the world than I expect, and I want to see how far we can actually reach. Someone in New Zealand, someone in Canada, someone in rural Japan, all sitting with the same questions at the same time without knowing it. That's quite extraordinary. And as always, the visuals are here to set the mood, but they're not required to follow along. In our last episode, we went back to the very beginning of recorded human history. We sat with the Sumerian clay tablets, 4,000 years old, describing beings who descended from the sky, transferred advanced knowledge to early civilization, and then withdrew. We read the Egyptian sky fire records, the Vedic flying craft, the Book of Enoch's watchers, described in nearly identical terms by cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And at the end, we asked a question, not about ancient history, about now. Every one of those civilizations didn't just describe visitors, they described something darker, entities that don't just observe, they manipulate, that don't just appear, they deceive, that operate through the one mechanism requiring no physical technology at all, control of what we believe is real. 2,000 years ago, a group of radical thinkers went further than any of them. They didn't just describe the visitors, they mapped the entire system, the architecture, the administrators, the purpose, and they claimed, with the kind of certainty that gets people killed, that they had found a way out. Their texts were buried in the Egyptian desert, their followers were hunted to extinction. The early church tried to burn every word they ever wrote. In 1945, those words were found. Today, we read them. Now, let's begin. December 1945. Upper Egypt. A region called Jabal al-Tarif, a limestone cliff riddled with ancient burial caves, used and abandoned by civilizations stretching back 3,000 years. A farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliff base for sabach, a soft, mineral-rich fertilizer soil, when his mattock struck something hard, a sealed clay jar approximately a meter tall. He hesitated. In local tradition, jars like this sometimes contained spirits. He broke it open anyway. Inside, 13 leather-bound codices, papyrus pages, pressed and preserved by the dry desert air for 16 centuries, 52 separate texts written in Coptic, the language of early Egyptian Christianity, translated from even older Greek originals. Some of these texts predated anything in the canonical New Testament. Some described a version of reality so different from official Christian doctrine that the Church hadn't just banned them. It had tried to make it impossible for them to exist at all. Think about what that means. Someone, in the 4th century, almost certainly a monk from the nearby monastery of St. Pachomius, had carefully gathered these texts, sealed them in that jar, and buried them in direct response to a formal decree issued in 367 CE by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. Athanasius had drawn up the approved list of sacred texts. Everything not on that list was to be destroyed immediately. Someone chose to hide the truth instead. The texts Muhammad Ali found are now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, and what they contain is not theology, not philosophy, not mythology in the comfortable, dismissible sense. What they contain is an investigation, a detailed, precise account of who constructed this reality, what it actually is, what entities operate within it, and why most of humanity has no idea any of this is happening. That is not a dramatic interpretation. That is, with precision, what the texts say. Now, who wrote these texts? And why were they considered so dangerous that an institution with the power of the early Roman Church felt the need to systematically hunt down and destroy every copy it could find? The answer requires us to understand who the Gnostics actually were. And I want you to set aside everything you think you know about ancient religion, because this is not a theology lesson. Think of it this way. If the early church was the official government narrative, the authorized version, carefully managed, enforced by imperial power, then the Gnostics were the investigative journalists operating underneath it. They weren't interested in faith. They were interested in direct knowledge. The Greek word the movement takes its name from, Gnosis, means direct experiential knowing. Not belief, not doctrine, evidence. They were asking the questions that the institution needed people to stop asking, and the institution responded the way institutions always respond to inconvenient investigators. It destroyed them. The Gnostic movement was not a single unified religion. It was a broad, diverse network of thinkers, communities, and traditions that flourished in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, primarily across Egypt, Syria, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Some were Jewish, some were Christian, some drew from Persian traditions, some from Platonic philosophy. What united them wasn't doctrine, it was a shared conviction. The world as we experience it is not what it appears to be. Not in the vague, metaphorical sense we might use that phrase today. In a precise, structural, operational sense. The Gnostics claimed that the material world, the physical reality we inhabit, with its suffering, its cycles of birth and death, its confusion, its forgetting, was not created by the highest divine intelligence. It was created by a lesser entity, an imposter, and that entity, along with the non-human intelligences that serve it, actively works to keep human beings ignorant of their true nature. Pause on that, because if you've been following this investigation, if you've been watching this channel, that framework should sound immediately familiar. An advanced intelligence operating above human perception, a system designed to contain and deceive, a suppression of the information that would allow humanity to understand what is actually happening, knowledge held by a small group and destroyed when it threatened to spread. The Gnostics weren't describing theology, they were describing a cover-up, and they had developed, across centuries of investigation, a remarkably detailed map of exactly how it worked. The Gnostics were prolific writers. They produced Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas, which contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, none of which appear in the canonical Bible. They produced cosmological treatises. They produced what can only be described as field reports, detailed accounts of the non-human intelligences they believed inhabited this reality, their nature, their methods, their agenda. The institutional response was totalizing. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus of Lyon produced a 5-volume work called Adversus Heresies, Against Heresies, specifically targeting Gnostic belief systems. It is, in effect, an early disinformation campaign. Irenaeus didn't engage with the arguments. He declared the Gnostics agents of deception and called for their elimination. By the 4th century, the campaign had succeeded. Gnostic communities were dismantled, their libraries burned, their teachers killed or driven underground, and a uniform, controllable version of Christianity, one that required faith, not investigation, obedience, not direct knowledge, was installed as the official operating system of the Roman Empire. The Nag Hammadi texts survived because one person, in one location, made one decision to hide a jar in the sand. 1600 years later, we have the chance to read what was supposed to be gone forever. So what did they actually know? The centerpiece of Gnostic cosmology, the element that made these texts most dangerous to the early church, is the concept of the Archons. Archon is a Greek word meaning ruler. In the Gnostic texts, particularly the Apocryphon of John, one of the most significant documents recovered at Nag Hammadi, the Archons are described as non-human intelligences that inhabit and administer the material world. They are not gods in the worshipful sense. They are not demons in the moral sense. They are something far more unsettling than either. They are managers, administrators, entities whose function is to keep human consciousness confined within a specific range of experience, precisely the range that doesn't allow us to perceive what we actually are. The Apocryphon of John describes the Archons with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as allegory. They are capable of taking on physical forms, but those forms are described as mimicry, imitation. They can appear as recognizable beings, but they are not what they appear to be. Their defining characteristic, repeated across multiple Gnostic texts, is deception through appearance. Now, I want to hold two things side by side, because what I'm about to describe is not a leap. It is a direct, documented comparison. In modern UAP encounter reports, the close encounter and contact cases documented by researchers including Dr. John Mack of Harvard University, and within classified government program records that have since been partially declassified, certain characteristics repeat with a consistency that is, at minimum, difficult to explain away. Entities that appear to shift form, that communicate not through spoken language, but through what witnesses consistently describe as direct transmission, thought insertion, or the sudden arrival of complex knowledge the witness cannot account for. Encounters characterized by an overwhelming sense of unreality, as if the normal operating conditions of perception have been suspended, and a paralysis, not physical restraint, something deeper, a stillness that operates below the level of the body. The Gnostic texts describe Archon encounters in functionally identical terms. The entity appears. The experiencer cannot act. Communication occurs through impression rather than speech, and afterwards, consistently, across both ancient accounts and modern testimony, the witness is left with the sense that something was taken, or inserted, or fundamentally altered in a way they cannot quite locate. I'm not telling you the Archons and the entities in UAP encounters are the same thing. What I am telling you is this: people separated by 2,000 years, across completely different cultural frameworks, with no access to each other's records, are describing the same phenomenology, the same mechanism, the same characteristics of the encounter. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. There is one Archon characteristic that appears in the Gnostic texts with particular emphasis, and that modern researchers have independently noted in UAP encounter documentation. The Archons are described as having an inability to create. They can only copy. In the precise language of the Apocryphon of John, they are counterfeit, imitating the structures of genuine intelligence without possessing its substance. In modern encounter reports, this quality appears as mimicry. Entities that adopt forms that are recognizable, human or near human, but with something wrong, a detail off, a quality of wrongness that witnesses struggle to articulate but report with striking consistency, the feeling that what you're looking at isn't really what it's showing you. The Gnostics called it the nature of the counterfeit spirit. 2,000 years. Two completely separate investigative traditions. One description. If the Archons are the administrators, the Demiurge is the architect. The word Demiurge comes from the Greek demiurgos, craftsman. In Gnostic cosmology, the Demiurge is the entity responsible for the construction of the physical world. Not the universe in its highest form, not what the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness of authentic reality beyond the material realm, but specifically this world, the world of matter, time, limitation, suffering. The Demiurge didn't create the material world out of love or wisdom. The Gnostic texts are precise on this point. The Demiurge created it because it believed itself to be the highest intelligence in existence, when in reality it was a secondary entity, operating below the true divine, unaware of or indifferent to what lay beyond it. The word the Gnostics used for this condition is striking, not evil, not malice. Ignorance. The material world is, in the Gnostic framework, a mistake made by an entity that didn't fully understand what it was doing. And then, when human beings began to awaken to the nature of that mistake, moved systematically to prevent that awakening. Now, I want to bring this forward, from the 2nd century to the 21st. Because what the Gnostics described as cosmology, some of the most credentialed scientific and philosophical minds alive today are describing as a serious formal hypothesis. In 2003, philosopher Nick Bostrom of Oxford University published a paper presenting a formal logical argument, since widely cited in peer-reviewed literature, that at least one of the following must be true. Civilizations capable of creating simulated realities don't survive long enough to do so. Those that survive choose not to create them, or we are almost certainly living inside one right now. The argument has not been refuted. It has been debated, refined, and taken seriously by physicists and philosophers at the highest level of the field. In 2016, Elon Musk stated publicly, without hedging, without drama, as if reporting something that seemed to him nearly self-evident, that the probability we are living in base reality, genuine unmediated physical existence, is approximately 1 in billions. And then there is James Gates, a theoretical physicist who worked on supersymmetry equations for the US Department of Energy. Gates reported finding, embedded in the fundamental mathematics of physics, what he described as error-correcting codes. Not metaphorically, literally. The specific type of code he identified is browser code, the kind used in internet search engines, existing, apparently, at the mathematical bedrock of physical reality. A counterfeit world, built by a lesser intelligence, containing, at its most fundamental mathematical layer, the signature of construction. The Gnostics described this, with precision, in the 2nd century CE. The most advanced physics of our era is arriving at the same destination from the opposite direction. The question that hangs over both investigations is identical. If this reality is constructed, who constructed it? And what, exactly, is it for? The Gnostics had a very specific answer to that question, and it is the most unsettling part of everything they wrote. The Gnostics described the human being as a paradox, something divine trapped inside something constructed. They used the term pneuma, spirit, to describe what they believed was at the core of human consciousness, a fragment of genuine, authentic divine intelligence from beyond the material realm, enclosed inside a physical body, inside a counterfeit reality, with no memory of what it actually is. They called the condition of ordinary human existence the hyllic state, from the Greek hyle, meaning matter, a consciousness so thoroughly embedded in the material world that it perceives no reality beyond it, no awareness that the limits it experiences as absolute, death, time, suffering, ignorance, are not the limits of reality itself, only the limits of the prison. Here is the metaphor I keep returning to when I try to describe what the Gnostics were articulating. Imagine a smartphone, powerful hardware, capable, in principle, of extraordinary things, but someone has installed a custom operating system on it, an OS that restricts what the hardware can do, that locks certain functions, that redirects attention toward specific inputs and away from others. You use the phone every day, it works, but you are running someone else's software on your own hardware without knowing the original code is still underneath. That is, with near-perfect precision, what the Gnostics were describing. The pneuma, the divine spark, is the original hardware. The material world, with its cycles of distraction and suffering and forgetting, is the custom operating system, and the Archons and the Demiurge are the ones who wrote the code. The mechanism for maintaining this condition was not violence, not coercion. It was something far more elegant and far more durable. Forgetting. Each human life, in the Gnostic cosmology, begins with what they called the amnesia of birth. Consciousness enters the material world stripped of its memory of what it is, and the structures of the material world, the demands of survival, the noise of social existence, the relentless focus on the immediate and the physical, serve as a continuous reinforcement of that forgetting. You don't need to chain someone in a prison if you can make them forget they were ever free. When you look at the pattern of erasure we've traced across this entire investigation, the Sumerian accounts quietly filed in museum storage, the Thule papyrus disappeared into Vatican archives, the Book of Enoch excluded from the Bible despite being directly quoted in it, the Library of Alexandria burned, every Gnostic text the early church could locate destroyed. When you look at that pattern as a whole, one question becomes very difficult to avoid. What if the forgetting isn't accidental? What if the erasure isn't a side effect of institutional power, but the purpose of it? Across 6,000 years of recorded history, the same category of knowledge keeps disappearing. Knowledge about what visits this planet. Knowledge about what human consciousness actually is. Knowledge about the constructed nature of material reality. Different civilizations, different centuries, different institutions, same result. Gone. The Gnostics were the clearest articulators of why, because they were the ones who named what was doing the erasing and described in precise detail the system it was protecting. What do we know? In 1945, a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert was broken open. Inside, 52 texts, 1,600 years old, belonging to a movement that had been systematically hunted and destroyed by one of the most powerful institutions in human history. The question worth asking is never just what was found. It's why someone with the power to burn libraries across an empire felt the need to burn these ones specifically. The Gnostics described non-human intelligences, the Archons, with characteristics that match across 2,000 years of separate investigation, the phenomenology documented in modern UAP encounters. Shapeshifting, thought transmission, suspended perception, an overriding quality of mimicry and deception. These are not loose parallels. They are operational descriptions of the same encounter type, told from opposite ends of history. The Gnostics described the material world as a constructed reality, built by a lesser intelligence, administered by entities that cannot create but only copy, maintained through the systematic erasure of the knowledge that would expose it. In 2026, credentialed physicists are presenting peer-reviewed arguments that our reality is almost certainly simulated. Nick Bostrom's argument stands unrefuted. James Gates found error-correcting code in the equations of physics. The Gnostics arrived at the same conclusion 2,000 years earlier and were destroyed for saying so. And at the center of all of it is the divine spark, the pneuma. The Gnostic conviction that inside each human being is something the constructed system cannot reach, a fragment of authentic reality, of genuine intelligence, and that the entire architecture of the material world exists, in some sense, to prevent that fragment from remembering what it is. If that sounds like a description of a prison, The Gnostics would agree with you. They were the first investigators to name it as one. And now we arrive at the question they were killed for asking, not just what the prison is, but whether it has a door. If this investigation is pulling at something you can't quite put down, hit that like button and subscribe. We go deeper every single episode. And tell me in the comments which part of this unsettled you the most. The Archon descriptions, the simulation theory convergence, or something else entirely. I read every comment. This community asks the questions most people are afraid to ask out loud. The Archons, the Demiurge, a counterfeit reality designed to trap the divine spark inside every human being. But the Gnostics didn't just describe the prison. They left us the escape plan. Inside the Nag Hammadi texts, buried alongside the cosmological warnings, alongside the descriptions of the Archons and the system they administer, there are specific, detailed instructions, practices, a map not of the prison, but of the door out of it. The Gnostics called the destination Gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of your own divine nature, the kind of knowing the constructed system cannot intercept because it operates below the level of perception the Archons can reach, below the operating system in the original code. They believed a human being who achieved genuine Gnosis was free, not after death, not in some distant spiritual future. Free now, awake inside the simulation, running original hardware underneath someone else's prison. And the institution that burned their libraries, hunted their communities, and tried to erase 16 centuries of their work knew exactly what that meant. Which is precisely why they tried so hard to make sure you'd never hear about it. Next episode, we open the escape plan. We read the specific Gnostic practices. We trace how they survived, hidden inside the very traditions that were supposed to replace them. And we ask the question this entire investigation has been building toward. If the prison has a door, and the Gnostics believed it does, where is the key? This is Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. Thanks for watching.